everyone, and thank you for joining us for this evening. My name is Shauna, and I'm the Public Programming Manager at the Manitoba Crafts Museum and Library. We would like to acknowledge that the Manitoba Crafts Museum and Library is located on, and we are broadcasting this talk from Treaty 1 territory, and that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I would like to introduce our speaker tonight, Claire Sparling. Claire is a textile artist based in Winnipeg. She has been sewing, knitting, spinning, and weaving from a young age. In her practice, Claire drafts patterns, tailors, and creates custom clothing, as well as recreations of historical clothing. Claire has worked in wardrobe departments and at the Prairie Theatre Exchange, the Royal Winnipeg Ballet, and Festival du Voyageur. Currently, Claire is working on making masks. To start off, we are going to show a pre-recorded video of Claire taking a look at some sewing tools and samplers in the Manitoba Crafts Museum and Library collection. If you have any questions during the talk, you can send them in the chat box located at the bottom menu, and I will pass them on to Claire. We will also be having a dedicated question period at the end, so you can save your questions till then as well.
You guys, let's see if I can put myself, there we go. Let's not have you guys sideways. So what I was talking about back in the, I guess 2 weeks ago, were a bunch of different tools that the Manitoba Craft Museum and Library has in their collection. And a lot of these are very, very beautiful, very delicate. Some have seen a lot of use, and some are very, very similar to things that we still have kicking around in our own sewing baskets. So what I'm kind of wanting to do with this talk is to, well, go through my sewing basket, as embarrassing as it might be, and talk about the different tools and how the tools you kind of collect define, and I don't want to come out as too new agey, but you have to develop a relationship with the tool that you're working with in order to do the craft that you want to do. And so the more you can think about how you're going to be interacting with those tools, what you need out of the tools, the better you're going to be able to work with the tools to make the thing you're wanting to make. So I was going to start out by just talking about what I have here, which is, well, one of my sewing trays, which contains 2 sewing baskets and more tools. I'm talking to you from my shop. I'm lucky enough to have a actual sewing shop in my home. And so this would have been the living room of the house, but it houses Josephine, my reliable Singer sewing machine, which belonged to my great grandmother. And the mess you can't see on the other side of the screen is where a lot of other things happen. And yes, of course, my trusty iron and a bunch of ironing tools we can talk about. But going through my sewing baskets, I was talking about the basket, that beautiful yellow velvet one, to me kind of almost spoke makeup box. And I don't know exactly what it was, but when I started sewing, I was gifted the tiny little dollar store sewing box, and I treasured it. And of course, all the needles broke and I used up all the threads. And then I started amassing these sewing tools, and I didn't really know where to put them. And my mother had gifted me with this rawhide box. Actually, it's actually quite lovely. There's a lid. Actually, it was a regift. She got it at a Christmas event and then didn't know what to do with it, so she gave it to me, and it fit my tools beautifully. And then, of course, my collection grew, and there was not quite enough room for things, so I upgraded to a slightly bigger basket, but I still need the smaller ones to fit into a smaller setting. And then, of course, it grew and grew. This was built as a sewing box, not specifically for me, but I did pick it up at an event. I walked around with my tools in a bag and went and tried different boxes, and I was the person that would go to the box maker and say, hey, I want to see if my scissors and my stitch ripper fit in the box. So that is that. I also had a large chest made that was specifically designed to fit the Gutermann rolls of thread. It was specifically deep enough to fit the case for my my stitch rippers, and it kind of just grew into this room, which has a designed table to be exactly my height. It has a caddy on the side to put all my tools. And it's just, when you look around at the tools I have, each tool has a story, a reason I picked it. And so, yeah, I can keep going through these items. We were talking
Sorry
about
to interrupt,
pincushion.
Claire.
Yes,
But
yes.
have the
Are there any
video
questions?
ready to go if you.
Oh, perfect.
Okay.
Sewing kits kind of define the relationship that people have with their tools, with their craft, with sewing. And here we have a couple different examples that the Manitoba Craft Museum and Library has in their collection. So there's a couple different types of sewing kits. There's a sewing kit that you buy from the store as a kit. But there's also the sewing kit which you make specifically to fit the tools that you have assembled. And also there's the kit that you put together in the box that happens to fit all your tools. I want to start by showing you a beautiful example of a sewing kit. They're also sometimes known as housewives. And this one is beautifully embroidered. It is made with a lot of different pockets, presumably made for specific tools in mind. Bigger pockets would fit scissors, smaller pockets were good places to put spare buttons, and smaller tools like stilettos or clippers. This to me looks like something specifically made to fit a thimble. You also have little loops here, presumably to put skeins of yarn. And again, it's beautifully embroidered, and I think by the writing on it, it is meant as a gift. We have other samples of different kits made for purpose. This one is made specifically to fit different presumably colors of embroidery thread. Similarly to this one, which also has these channels and as demonstrated fits these skeins of embroidery thread. Another example we have here is this little roll, which has underneath it on the bottom a spot for your yarn, and then you can just pin your needles and threads and you can roll it up. Now another very interesting sewing kit that is in the collection here is this, it's labeled as a sewing box, and I'll show it to you here. When you open it, it has a mirror, but it also has what I think might be a spot for makeup brushes. But it does fit all the sewing tools necessarily quite nicely. So here we have an assortment of various tools that could be found in any sewing basket. Back then, 100 years ago, or even today. These tools haven't evolved a whole lot or changed much in the past several hundred years, and I'll show you when we get to my shop how some of these tools are still used, how some of them have changed, and how some of them are still basically the same. And so to start out, we have pincushions. Pincushions can be very beautifully decorated, or they can be very utilitarian. This one is a beautifully embroidered one, and it has a loop. The thing with pincushions is if they are too light, when you try to poke them with a pin, they run away on you, they move. And so to be able to anchor down a pincushion, I find as a professional tailor, is a very important part of it. So I would hazard that this loop was either to tie it to yourself or else to anchor it down to a table or chair. We have a similar pincushion here. This one is just plain fabric. And then we also have a pin ball. These pin balls, this one is knit, but basically they are round balls I used to put pins, and this one has a tie, so again you can tie it onto your waistband, and so you always have your pins and needles on your person at all times in case you need them. Another tool that really has not changed at all are needles. Needles I find that there's a very delicate balance between which needle you want, and there's a ratio between the thickness of the thread, the thickness of the fabric that you're working with, and the size of the needle you want to work with. So over here we have Singer needles. I still use similar needles. They still come in all sorts of different sizes. I personally do like the ones with the gold plated eyes. What that does is it's a softer edge on the thread so that you don't risk cutting your thread on that sharp bit of steel as you're passing your thread through the eye of the needle. Of course, if you're doing any sort of hand stitching, thimbles will be very, very important part of the game. Here we have two thimbles, and you can notice that this one is actually not round. Thimbles tend to be made round, but even this one has been slightly made to be oblong. And the reason for that is that your finger isn't perfectly round. So quite often what I do with my thimbles is I will smash them down a little bit to make them more oblong so they fit my finger more comfortably. And that is something that people did back then when they were working with their own tools. Moving on, we have here a piece of beeswax. I still use beeswax in my shop. It's a great way to coat the thread. As the thread moves through the fabric, it does wear out. So by the end of your long thread, that end piece is less strong than the thread was at the very beginning. So waxing thread is still a thing that I do quite often. Of course, scissors are a very important part of cutting fabric and thread. We have two different kinds of scissors here. These are thread scissors. They're just small scissors made to cut thread, clip small bits of fabric. And I will show you the similar pair that I have in my shop. And I also want to show you these. Now these are called gap tooth scissors or buttonhole scissors. And you'll notice that there is a gap here. I'll show you in my shop how to use them, but it's to cut buttonholes to make sure that they are exactly the right distance from the edge. That's what that gap there is for. Of course, talking about hand stitching, something that we don't talk about anymore when we talk about hand stitching is how to sew under tension. And if you look at this little thing, it is a beautiful little bird. And it's got a wear point here. I'm wondering if this wasn't a spot for a pin cushion. I know that oftentimes they will have a pin cushion. But if you pinch the tails of the bird together, you'll see his mouth opens. This is also known as sewing birds, also known as a third hand. And the idea is that the bird is holding down the fabric so that you can put tension on it for quick sewing. And I will show you how that system can be set up on the birds I have in my shop. And I'll just show you more closely. This part would be made so that you can clamp it down onto the side of a table or chair, and then you can again pinch the bird tails here, and that would clamp down on the fabric and hold your fabric in place for you. To continue on the exploration of a sewing basket, I know when I was going through my grandmother's sewing basket there was a light bulb in there. Just a big lamp light bulb, and I was unsure as to what it was until my mother said, oh, she used it for darning. So here we have two different darning eggs. My grandma used a light bulb, and my other grandma had a doorknob in her sewing basket. That's because when we think of darning eggs, we usually want to think of something egg-shaped or something wooden. But when you think of what the tool needs to be, all it needs to be is roundish and hardish, so you can stretch the heel of the sock over it to work. So if you're looking through your grandmother's sewing basket or your own sewing basket, you might find that there are a lot of kind of strange tools that you don't necessarily recognize for its use until you think about it a little bit differently. Finally, I want to show you this little tool. This tool claims to be a Tailor's Instant Tacker. I'm not sure from when it dates, but it's one of the many gizmos that has been marketed in order to help home sewers do more sewing. Now I'm going to show you how I do Tailor's Tack without this little nifty contraption. So when we talk about sewing today, we think about perhaps our home economic. We think about that quilt that we keep trying to start or make or finish, the pants we still have to hem, and also perhaps the shirt that needs mending or the garment that needs a new button. It is only recently that we have stopped as a culture focusing on sewing education and sewing literacy. I think about it in the way that today a general broad statement could be made that everyone knows how to type. Okay, not everyone knows how to type 140 words a minute, but everybody can put an email together either with bits of fingers or dictation, but everyone knows how to manipulate that to create a document. Some better than others, and the same can be said about people 50 years ago, even 100 years ago, who all knew how to thread a needle and mend their clothes. Perhaps not build beautiful ball gowns, but everyone knew how to make a shirt. Broadly speaking, of course. What we have here are some samplers, some exquisitely done samplers made with the idea of learning and teaching how to do certain stitches and how to do certain aspects of garments. We're going to start over here with a 4-H sewing instructional booklet. And if you look at this as a curriculum, it starts out with instructions on basic seams, as well as the sample homework that was done by the student. So various seams. It spends a lot of time looking at how to assemble, the vocabulary of sewing, what's a whip stitch, what's a running stitch, what's a blind hem, all these different corners, these different techniques, different methods. And it is a truly beautiful collection of resource material. The next item I want to talk about is this sample. So this sample has been dated, and it is, I find, very, very interesting because there are certain areas where the sewer has chosen or was told to use red thread. And that gives us a very nice contrast on being able to see the stitches. So if we look at this red line, this seam is the exact same structure as this one, but this one they have chosen to use a matching thread. So you can see the level of invisibility that happens. This square in the center here is a patch. And you can see that if these threads were white or cream as opposed to red, it would be almost invisible. And we can see the back also just as beautifully done. The other things that the sample has is corner patch or edge patches, but also practice eyelets, buttonholes, and how to set in hooks and eyes, which are very important. There's also examples of how to do neckline gussets, either sewing them together, or there's also a lovely example of faggoting right here, as well as corner joins. This piece is the tiniest little sleeve. If I bring it close up, you can see how delicate the stitching is. Now imagine having to do this much work on one sleeve. Imagine making the entire garment, and at an adult size. And this brings us to the point that clothing was much more precious. There was much more work. There still is a lot of work that is put into garment. But I think we all need to sometimes remember the amount of work that goes into the clothes we wear, that we wear out, that we throw away, not even when they grow old, but when they just don't suit us anymore. And I think this is a really excellent reminder of the work and labor that goes into garmentry. Finally, I really am excited by this sample. This one, it's been initialed, but you can see again different finishing techniques on the hem, different practices of how to gather, how to make a cuff, how to turn things under. You have practice loops, plackets, buttonholes, eyelets, mending or darning patches, more darning. And again, these were spots that were made on purpose. Somebody cut out this hole to then be able to practice putting it back together. Again, we have patches that are rectangles. We also have a practice patch on the bias. And if I turn this over, you can see what the reverse side looks like, and it's all very, very neatly put together. Further down on this sample, we have examples of cut thread decoration, as well as pleating and cording and joins. So again, a reminder of how much work goes into garment making, but also how much skill is put in, and how much practice and practice and practice had to be put into needlework in order to get to the level that are in these examples.
Okay. So I guess that here's the question. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So after having visited those samplers, I find it really interesting looking at how tools will evolve for function and form, and kind of going back on the kind of the theme of talking about that sewing kits, which I've kind of touched on already. I always find it's really interesting to go through my sewing basket and find, oh, there's that little bit of thing that I needed for that other project, and oh, isn't it a great thing that I put this lost button in here, because now I have one for emergency mending. So I find that sewing kits are often full, or mine at least is often full of junk, but it's all has a story. It's all very useful junk when you end up looking at it. So some interesting tools I want to highlight, if we look at the collection here, we were talking about pin cushions, and I have very strong feelings about pin cushions. I firmly believe that those little red tomatoes that you get at Fabricland are not super helpful, because whenever you approach them with a pin, they move, they run away, and I like my pin cushions to stay in place. So I actually have a blacksmith friend who gave me, I can't even remember how many, but a whole bunch of iron bar rectangles that I then put wool and then covered in beautiful velvet. You can see they are wearing out, and I will have to recover them. This has been, oh gosh, about 8 years at least that I've been using this particular pin cushion, and I'll just push this aside. When I stick it with a pin, it stays in place. And so that is something that I've learned. A friend of mine gave me this beautiful little strawberry pin cushion, which is absolutely lovely. And and I like having it around. The thing is, it wobbles, and when you try to stab it with a pin, it moves, and I like being in control of my tools. So this one is more of a needle holder or a decorative piece. Another pin cushion that I have picked up along my journeys, this one is ceramic. Again, I like stuffing mine with raw wool because I find it polishes the needles a little bit and keeps them from rusting. Not that that really ever happens in my shop, but I find it holds the needles in place and the pins quite well. This pin cushion, and talking about stories, this particular pin cushion was made by a very dear friend of mine as a wedding gift. And apparently she put a love note in there. It's, I have no idea what it says, but it's in there. And that kind of speaks to the tradition of how women in particular had relationship with their tools, and how often the gift of a sewing tool, sewing kit, sewing item was a very common gift that one woman would give to another as a sign of friendship, as a sign of connection, and also beautiful steel pins. This one as well, I believe, is stuffed with wool, and it just keeps the pins nice and shiny. And again, this one's lighter, but it's not meant to be a pin cushion as much as a ball of pins that can then be tied to your waistband with a ribbon. I was talking about darning eggs, and this is the famous doorknob. It is quite useful as a darning egg, but also I use it to rub seams flat. Thick cotton, I do historical recreations, and I have been working on canvas tent making, and you can't really put a whole tent through the iron. So a tool that was commonly used, it was called a sailor's rubber, or a seam rubber. And it's a tool, it's a hard tool, and it's meant to flatten down the cotton, and you press it, and that friction will give the heat and the pressure necessary to set the fold. This is what they actually should look like. And you hold it, and you would press down on your fabric. So you would fold your fabric in half, and instead of using an iron, you would just press down. And this tool, actually, there was a gentleman who was trying to sell me one, and he had made it because he had found a sample, and he had used his own hand to figure out what size it was with, and he was trying to get me to buy this really well, beautifully made seam rubber, but I was not going to buy it because it didn't feel right in my hand. I couldn't hold it properly, and I knew that I wouldn't be able to maneuver it. So I told him, you know what, it needs to be this size, and I gave him the dimensions, and I told him next year I will buy it from you. And this is the one he ended up making. But I had to specifically go into that conversation knowing, okay, this is what I need from it, and I know I can't handle specific size tools. Let's talk about sharp things. Now, we didn't really go into depth in about scissors with the collection. Oh, is there a question? Yes. Jonah has her hand up. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question? Is that an option?
She might have hit that button by accident.
Oh, it might be an accident.
Okay.
Chat,
So.
All right. Okay. Well, stop me if there's any other questions. Scissors are very much a part of the sewing story, and I had talked about the buttonhole scissors. So these are my buttonhole scissors, and I just want to talk about them because it is an item that we see often, but they look so strange. So basically the gap here will end up being what your distance is between the edge of your fabric and your buttonhole. And this little screw allows you to set how much bite there will be on the scissors, and that will dictate how long your buttonhole is. So I can go line up the edge of my fabric with the back of the scissors and then cut my hole, and everyone will be exactly the same size. So I think these are pretty cool. Oh, and backtracking a tiny bit, sewing baskets, we've talked about sewing tables, we've talked about my sewing chest. Of course, there's my sewing room, which I may give you a, you can see behind me. There's the table, the ironing board, and the sewing machine. But I have found when I'm going from working in different theater departments, different shops, I don't always know where they keep their tools, so I always bring mine with me. And this is my sewing apron, which I have made with specific pockets for scissors, pinking shears, thread cutters, paper scissors, a junk pocket to put measuring tools, and different pens. So again, talking about figuring out exactly what you need out of the tool and then making something to fill that void, I find is particularly fulfilling when you are able to think about what you need from the tools. Right, so another set of sharp things, of course, as a professional seamstress, tailor, I never actually use stitch rippers. That is a lie, I use them all the time. These seam rippers, I used to get all the time from Lee Valley. They're really great, they're really sharp, they're made by a company that makes scalpels. But after a long time, the plastic here corrodes and the blades just pop off. And so you lose control and it just becomes loose. And I like the concept, but I couldn't rely on the stability of this tool. So I upgraded. This is actually a carving knife. Yeah, this is now what I use as a stitch ripper, because I figured that the ergonomics of holding the tool, this was just a more comfortable tool that I would reach for and use. And yes, I do use a stitch ripper a lot more often than I'd like to admit, but just as often as every other person dealing with fabric and threads does. So once again, figuring out what your hand needs. Thimbles. I have a collection of thimbles. Starting with, this is my favorite thimble. It is my favorite because the oblong shape, I managed to squish it into the perfect shape. And I used to have round thimbles, but they always fall off. The suction never is quite right. So I've purposefully smashed these with a hammer to make them fit. So I have that one. And the way this one works, or the way I sew with this kind, is you hold the needle. Just gonna get that out of the background. You're using the tip of, very, very tip of your finger. And what you're doing is you're levering that, and that is what is giving you the leverage to push onto the eye of the needle. And then you can do whatever stitch you are working on. So that is this kind of thimble. And then I also have, when on one of my travels, I picked up a little, where is it now? I have too many of them. Here it is. I picked up it's a ring, and you're meant to hold the needle. This is a Japanese way of sewing, apparently. You're meant to hold the needle on the side of your finger. And so you're levering it this way. Now, of course, this is way too big. So I MacGyvered myself one that fits my finger much better. And then this one, I can just use the side of my finger. And I find that depending on what fabric I'm working through, using the side of my finger versus the back of the back of the finger, or even the tip of the finger. It just depends what kind of stitch. If I'm doing a pad stitch, it's a lot easier to do it quickly with the side of the finger as opposed to the point of the finger. This one is very similar to this one, but it's a full ring, and it's meant to sit right on the knuckle to use the back of the finger. I also have, this is called a Tailor's thimble. And I've noticed this, most women I know tend to use the tip of their finger or the side. Most of the men I know use the back of the nail. And I'm not really sure what that means. Just I've noticed a difference is how people approach these different tools. Now, of course, talking about needles, thimbles, we have to talk about needles. I can't tell you which one is my favorite needle because, again, it's constantly a conversation between me and the thread and the fabric to figure out which thread will work better. I once got a rather bad hand injury because, I'll show you here, when I would do a stitch, you want your needle to not be too much thicker than the thread because you want it all to go through without making too big of a hole. But if you, sometimes there's that little jerk resistance, that means that your needle is actually a little bit too small. And I sewed an entire jacket with a slightly too small needle, and I ended up with a rather bad hand injury, which taught me the lesson of do 2 stitches. If it doesn't feel right, switch your needle, try something different, figure out what will work for your body and for your hands, because that really is the most important part of this. If you want to keep doing it, you have to figure out how you can do it safely. Of course, needles, threads, beeswax is often overlooked. You can get beeswax. This is the one I use. I think we talked about some in the video. It's just plain old beeswax you can get at the, usually the honey store will have some. But my favorite is actually charcoal filtered beeswax. And the secret is you go to Bee Made and you ask for their charcoal filtered beeswax. It's white as opposed to yellow, and which means it doesn't graze your thread as you're rubbing it. So sometimes if I was working with white thread on white fabric, that, of course, my hands are always clean, but there's always a little bit of grime that gets stuck in the yellow beeswax, which has a bit of a color. And so you end up with this like gray line where you're sewing. So this white beeswax, you can get it at Bee Made. Not that they're paying me or anything, but, and I find it's a little bit harder, so it doesn't tend to break your thread as you're working through it. Now, this is a revolutionary tool. We talked about the sewing birds. These are my sewing birds, and they're little clamps, and they work just the same way. They have a tether. I actually have a sewing armchair that I will pin this to, or you can also just pin it to the table. And then you have your sewing project, you have your needle. Say you were doing a seam, you could take your needle and over and under and bend it and then pull through. Or what I find works even better is you clamp it down and then you can just do your whip stitch. Now, at this point, I'd like to say, are there any questions about anything up till now? Is there anything I've glossed over, anything you'd like me to go back on? Any questions? No? All right.
Claire,
Yes.
what is that clamp called?
This?
Yes.
So I know it as sewing birds. sailors will call them a third hand.
Okay.
A sailor's third hand is more of like a really big hook
Okay.
that will poke through the fabric. I've also heard it as a tailor's third hand. But the idea is that it's providing tension on what you're working on. You can also take a pin and pin it to the chair, the arm of the chair next to you, or even to your pant leg, and use that as an anchor point to sew from. But the idea is you're working under tension, so you're able to maintain that crease by pulling on it, as opposed to having to put tension on it with the back of your working hand. And so that's how they work. There's a lot of variations on whether it's a bird or whether it's a clamp or a little hook or however. There's a lot of different designs, but essentially it's a thing that bites and can be hooked onto something.
I'd seen the vintage birds before, but I didn't know if these were still called the same thing.
I've called them sewing birds as well, but I think it's a tailor's clamp is what this is being sold as.
I think my sewing kit needs one.
They're amazing. I never travel without it, or a long piece of twill tape that you tie around the chair of whoever's sitting next to you, and you can use that as an anchor point as well. You get really creative once you figure out how you have to settle yourself to sew. You start looking at, oh, that spot has the sun coming from the right direction. Oh, that spot will allow me to sit at a very specific angle. It's got a good spot for me to put my water. My sewing basket will be exactly at this height, and I can anchor my work to this spot. It's more than just how am I going to sew this. You also want to think of how's your body going to be as you're sewing. Oh, and the other thimble. It's not really a thimble. You've heard of sailor's palms. So when you're working with really thick leather, and usually sailor's palms will actually come from the protective plaque will be put on the ball of the thumb because you're pushing with your thumb. I find that this is not the strong part of my hand. I don't push with this part. I push with this part. So I made myself my own because I noticed this is how I'm working with this part of my hand, not this part. And so I put a piece of leather on my hand and figured out how it needed to be in order to let me do the work that I wanted to do in a as ergonomic and safe way as possible. So that's the Thimble Collection. Oh, and this one. Yeah. I mean, it's only 6 thimbles, right? It's not that bad of a collection. Any other questions? I talked about sewing scissors, but actually what I find is even better are chisels, buttonhole chisels. Now, these are specially made buttonhole chisels. I also have been known to use my brother's chiseling set to have the exact right size buttonhole that you can then hammer through. But again, with this chisel, and this one as well, they were specially made for me. And the length of the handle was designed so I could hold it so that the butt of the tool fits in the palm of my hand, and I can hold it very close to the blade so I can have complete control over it. If it's too long, you're holding it back, like backhanded, and you're trying to control it, or you're holding it and you're so far away from the blade that there's a lot of wobble. So yeah, I wanted to show you a couple samples as well. Samples are really, really important to make sure that you know what you are doing. Every fabric is a little bit different. Every thread is a little bit different. Every stitch will behave differently depending on the medium we're working on. So here I have a sample buttonhole. I have made, I can't even tell you how many of these partial samples I've made. I don't usually finish them. I just do the first couple stitches to see if this is the right thread to use with this fabric to make the right kind of buttonhole. And I don't even think I've kept most of them, but they would be hundreds of these. This is one that I have kept. It's a sample of buttonholes, and once again, I do these a lot. Talking about working in miniature, this is a scaled down adult size shirt that I made as a practice piece to be able to figure out the ratios of the patterns, but also practice stitches without having to make a 64-inch wide piece. I just worked on a foot wide piece. And so this is a way to practice your skills, but also practice how are you going to put it together. And working on a quarter scale allows you to practice without using all the fabric. And also it's a shorter amount of time, so you don't get completely disgusted with the project before you're done. Measuring tools. I'm sure you all have a pile of these kicking around. And what I have noticed is that a measuring tape will warp. It actually has a lifespan because see how this one's rippling? So the more, as a rule, it's probably not that important if you're working with bigger scales, but the more you use measuring tapes, the more especially the ends just get stretched out. And as much as they're made out of non-stretchy fabric, they do stretch and ripple. This one says fiberglass. And so it's something that you have to be aware of is how your measuring tape will age. And grandma's measuring tape is not the same as the brand new one from the sewing box. This is a fabric novelty one. And I made the unfortunate mistake of using this to take measurements and then using this one to actually draft. And as you can see, the numbers don't line up. So yeah, that was, and this is another novelty one. This one's actually to scale, but be aware of what your tools actually mean. And again, it doesn't really matter if you're always using the same measuring tape to do the measuring and the drafting, but if you have 16 of them in your sewing basket and you just randomly grab one and then you grab a different one to draft, it's again, it doesn't make that big of a difference when you're working on really loose scales, but when you start getting precise, suddenly your 11.5 inches is 12 inches, and then you might have a drastic problem with the size of your dress. Are there any questions, comments? So I have found that I don't always know what I'm looking for in a tool until I see it as well. So whenever I am traveling or in somebody else's shop, I'm always watching, oh, what are you using? How are you using it? And from there, I have accumulated a lot of very interesting, almost novelty items that have been lifesavers, or perhaps not lifesavers, but time savers. And gizmos like seam gauges, once you learn where all the different gauges are, but also measuring wheels. I don't know why I've never seen one of these in craft or fabric stores in Winnipeg, but maybe I'm just not looking for it. But this one I picked up in Japan, and I was awed by the existence of this simple tool, but it has made drafting so much faster. And then antique tools, like this tracing wheel. This has not changed from the plastic ones. It's still the basic same setup. There might be a little bit less wobble in the wheel, but it's essentially completes the same function. Another tool that I have customized for myself, I have, this is known as a ironing sausage. I have my ironing ham, and this is my clapper, or my ironing piece of wood. And this one I had adapted by a friend of mine who pours lead. And I had him drill holes in this piece of wood and pour lead in to increase the weight of it, so that when I'm ironing, I'll iron fairly hot, and then I can put this block, and I used to have to press hard on it to allow that crease to set within with the steam and the heat. But now I can just place it there because it's almost a pound heavier because of the lead. So again, I'm just kind of always thinking of, okay, how much can I make the tools work for me, so that I don't have to work at the tools or work against the tools. Any questions? No? Now we're getting into more measuring tools. I have two almost identical measuring Tailor squares. One is metric, one is in imperial. Both of them are rescues from sewing shops that didn't know what they were. And in fact, the first time I saw one, I thought, oh, okay, it's a basic carpenter L. But then you flip it over, and it's all marked in scale. So you have 2/3, 1/3, 6/12, and then you have 16th, 8ths, 4ths, and halves. So you don't need to know what 1/3 of 52 is. You just need to find it on your scale. Which again, there's so many tools that have existed that either I have had to rediscover because they were never taught to me, or people have let fall by the wayside because sewing, drafting, clothing making is no longer part of the general literacy that is taught in school. And I referenced this in the video earlier, that it might be a very broad statement to say that everyone today knows how to send an email. And I realize that there are some people that, for whatever reason, don't have access to the tools or the dexterity to do this. But as a broad statement, everyone can send an email. And in the same way, until fairly recently, everyone could make a shirt. Everyone could sew on a button. Everyone could fix that pair of pants. And I think it's very sad and scary that we no longer have that kind of control over the clothes we're putting on our bodies, over the way we can create our own identities by being in control of the shape of the garments we're putting on our bodies. I don't know if this is making sense, but I have definitely noticed when I'm teaching people how to sew, most people want to know how to mend, how to adjust, how to alter. And the amount of empowerment that I see them feeling when, oh, this jacket does really look nice if I just take in the arm a little bit or let out the side seam a little bit, and suddenly they're comfortable and the clothes is exactly what they wanted, as opposed to them feeling like they have to change their body to fit their clothes. So I might be wrapping up this talk a little bit early, but what I'm wanting to share with you guys is really the importance of knowing what you want out of the tools you're working with and knowing what you want to make with it. but also the amount of control that you have over the things you're creating is as much as you want to have. And as much as it's a poor carpenter that blames his tools, a good carpenter doesn't work against his tools. So you want to make sure that everything that you have at hand is working to the best of its abilities in order to be able to allow you to do the best of your work and create exactly what you want. Are there any questions or comments? Don't all speak at once.
This was really awesome. I really liked the overview of all your tools. I love tools.
Hi,
All
Jessica.
hi. All the little
Hi.
bits and pieces that have their own function and just discovering what they are and like, oh, how
Well,
can
I have lots more of those. I can keep going through the box of shame, and I don't necessarily have explanations for all the bubbles in here, but I can tell you that I may have stolen this awl from a rather good wood carver who said, "Here, this is the awl I just made, and it fit my hand perfectly." And then I said, "Can I have it?" And then he said, "But that's my favorite awl." And I said, "Okay, can I have it?" But this and this is another awl. This one's metal, and my brother actually carved a case to fit over it because the maker had made it out of a horn. But then when you hold it, I ended up poking a hole in my hand because I was pushing on it, and every time I'd push, it would hurt. So I had to make a cover for it so that it would feel more comfortable in my hand. A lighter is always good to have to burn things. These are the tiniest needles. They're betweens. And I don't know if you can quite see.
I'm using one of those right now.
Yeah, they're the best. They're made in Sheffield, and they I find they don't bend. So that makes them really easy to manipulate around fabric. Another awl, I have a lot of awls. And buttonhole threads. This is this fell off a uniform I was making. It's silver. It's a silver little frilly thing. I don't know why it's in my sewing box, but it is there, and maybe it will be worth its weight in silver someday. I also have random buttons. And then if we go inside here, I have my historically accurate sewing spectacles, a partially made jabot, a little frill, more needles, more needles, emergency hooks and eyes, elastic. That's that one. The other one, yes.
There's a question from Rebecca. Do you use curved rulers?
Yes, I do. I should show you my French curve. This is my French curve. This one's in metric, but to me, it doesn't really matter. It's got your hip curve, your neck curve, your armhole curve. A lot of times I end up kind of drawing the shape as I think it should feel. And then I'll just smooth it out with the curve. Any other questions?
Do you use a needle threader?
No. What I do is I will wax the end of the thread and lick it and then poke it through the eye of the needle. Sometimes when I'm working with like embroidery floss, I might, but usually if you're using a needle threader, that means that your thread has to go, you have to have the wire go through, and then it has to loop around your thread. So when you're pulling it, you have to be able to fit the diameter of the wire plus the diameter of the thread times 2 to be able to get it through. So the eye that you're going to be working with to be able to thread the needle is going to be a lot bigger than what you could just get with a thread. I also have the advantage of having fairly good eyesight. So I don't find it challenging to thread a needle. However, if you ask my husband to thread a needle, he will grab the biggest darning needle he can and still have difficulty threading the buttonhole thread. But yeah, does that answer the question? Something that I didn't talk about a whole lot is marking tools, but I can give you a quick survey of those. I do use Tailor's wax sometimes, but only if I'm working with darker wool, because I find that will sometimes leave a mark or a residue. So I often use chalk. This is a chalk pencil, and this is a roller chalk. So you can just roll. This is actual, what is it? It's a soapstone pencil. And that I find works really well on wool, and it rubs off. It does rub off eventually, but it doesn't rub off so fast that it disappears before you have the chance to do anything with the fabric you're working with. Because that's the other thing with chalk, is that you'll chalk everything out and then you've marked it. And then as you're working with it, it rubs off, which is great because you don't want it on, but you kind of needed to know where that mark was. I saw a question go by.
Yeah, can you show a Tailor's Tack?
Oh, Tailor's Tack, yes. So I'm using, so a Tailor's Tack is when you want to reinforce a seam join. So the way I would do it, and again, I don't knot my thread. A knot in a thread can be a weak point. So what I do is I very, very gently bring it close, but not all the way through, and I'm going to trim that off. So a Tailor's Tack would be, you do a couple loops. And then I usually will do a buttonhole stitch around the loops to keep them in place. Just like that. And then I would just poke it back through. Was it a Tailor's Tack or Tailor's Mark? That was the other tool that I had shown, that weird little gizmo. If you're marking out your pattern and say you've got a line that you're marking with a Tailor's Mark, when you use pins on fabric, you're slightly bending the fabric. So every time you bend that fabric a tiny bit, there's a difference between the top layer and the bottom layer. If you're working with a really thin cotton, that's usually not an issue. But when you're working with a medium wool, that little ripple can make a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch difference between the right and the left side. So a Tailor's Tack or a Tailor's Mark is you're just doing very loose, small stitches, and you want to make sure that the thread is moving around the fabric, not the fabric around the thread. And you want to leave a ripple in your thread. And that will become important when you're done your loops. So if I go tell this piece, so you've got your markings here and you've got your reverse markings here. And then if I very gently pull it open, then I can cut it and I will have the marks on both sides. It works better if you're using a fluffier thread. I was using a buttonhole thread, but if you use a tailoring thread, it's got a little bit of loft to it, so it will stick to the fabric a little bit better, kind of like Velcro. And again, here I was using the needle kind of at an angle, and that's to kind of get that rotation happening. When you're working with canvas and pad stitching, it's helpful if you can get a good clip on your movement. Any other questions? Here's a fun gizmo. This is another rescue from actually the Nygaard factory. It's an electric cutter. It makes about as much, a little bit less noise than like a power saw, but you plug it in and it's a electric rotary cutter, and it makes this really big noise, and you can cut through 12 layers of fabric at the same time, which has been great for mask making. Yeah, this is the reliable new addition to the team. The other thing that I haven't talked a whole lot about is something that I will often tell my students is name your sewing machine. Behind me is Josephine. It's my great grandmother's sewing machine. I also have Serge, the serger. By the window is Doris Day, the 1943 singer. And there's also Steve, the workhorse industrial machine, who only goes forwards. He doesn't even go backwards. But the reason I talk about naming your machine is that oftentimes it's not the machine's fault if something goes wrong. Often it's user error, or it's because you weren't paying attention and all the layers going underneath, that the extra layer got caught in under the sewing machine. And if you're thinking about your sewing machine as your teammate, you're not going to get as frustrated with it, because it's a part of your team. It's not your enemy. You're not working against it. You're both sitting down and working on this thing. And I will often start by sitting down at my sewing machine, and I'll tell my students, now give your sewing machine a compliment and tell it what you're doing. So, good morning, Josephine. You look quite in good shape today. And today we're going to make a beautiful dress. And that just puts your brain into the state that you're ready to create. You're ready to work with your tools. And it's not going to be some sort of wrestling match where you're battling against the fabric and against the sewing machine and against everyone. And it's just this frustrating mess. And sewing is a very emotional thing. And when we're looking at all these different tools, we're looking at how much delicateness and how much effort is put into the housewives, into decorating, into these samplers, into the pin balls. And there's just so much delicateness, but emotion being put into all these items that I I don't believe in new age theory that much, but there is something about being in the right mind space to be able to have a productive day with fibers. And if you believe my mom, where there are threads, there are pixies. So, and pixies, they can't help it. It's in their nature. They want to mess up all the threads. And as much as I think it kind of speaks to, there will be chaos. Nothing will ever work out exactly as planned. And part of the artistry is being able to adapt to the situation as it is, not as you think it should be. And the same thing goes with fitting. Oftentimes I'll be working on a garment, and for whatever reason, the person that is purchasing the garment, or whom the garment is destined, will change. Their bodies will not be exactly the same as when I measured them. As much as they promise me they don't change size, it happens. And it's about thinking ahead. What are the adjustments that might have to be made? What are the adjustments that could be made? And maybe you won't have to make any adjustments at all. But it's very much shooting at a moving target. And yeah, sometimes you're missing 4 inches of fabric, and you shouldn't have cut that second waistband. But there's always a way to figure out how to make it work.
So we have time for one more question. There's one question asking what the surface of your sewing table is made of.
Oh, so it's about 8 years old, and you can kind of see if I so it's a layer of vinyl, and underneath is 1/4 inch cork. And I really like it because I can do that, and can't see that color. I can take a pin and stick it straight in. And for drafting, it is super helpful. Even for putting garments together, sometimes it's nice to just be able to put a point exactly right there, and you stab it all the way through, and it stays right there. And that's actually my brother was the one who built this table for me. And we spent quite a lot of time back and forth between, well, what height he thought it should be and what height I wanted it to be, and what I needed to put into which drawers, how big I needed the space to be. The width of the table is just wide enough that I can reach to the other side. And I wanted to be able to do that so that you don't have to walk all the way around the table when your pencil runs away. And at first, in my old shop, this table was right against a wall. So if it was further than my reach, that pencil was gone. It was dead unless I climbed up onto the table and grabbed it. So there was a bunch of things that I had to think about. And the other thing is, I don't know if I can move this, all the way along the edge of the table. I've marked off measuring points so that I don't have to pull out my measuring tape. If I'm measuring out yardage and I know I need a 46-inch hem, I just need to find edge of table to 46, and that's my cut line. So thinking about how you're going to use your space and what you're going to need it to be was a big part of the design of the table, but also of the workflow of the rest of the shop. Does that answer the question? Probably more than the question.
Yeah, I think that just about does it. Thank you, Claire, for speaking tonight. It was very informative, and just love to getting to see what's in your sewing basket. Like I said before, or I mentioned this in the chat, but we will be posting a recording of this talk on our YouTube channel, and I'll also email it out to all the participants today. So,
okay.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It was great to see some faces, and thanks for visiting me in my workspace.